that we have a great influence over the unfoldment of our lives, but we have never really been given clarification of how that influences our lives. And so the significance of this is real in that I can provide you with this information, you can walk away with the information, but there's a point where actually you have to start participating in it, like I had to do it, and start to incorporate it into our lifestyle because we can change belief. What's unusual about these women? And what's unusual about these women are their ages. And if you check out the ages of these women, Dorothy at 75 years old is dancing every night in the Palm Springs Follies. The minimum age to get into the Follies is 55 years of age. The significance about these women is, of course, first of all, you notice the vitality that they have. You'll also probably recognize at some point that they don't get affected by the same things that other people experience as they get older. And so what is the issue that gives them this vitality? This is the basic question. Our conventional understanding is that genes provide for this. So all of us hear all the time in newspaper articles, on television and media about genes controlling this and genes controlling that. And the relevance is that we have come to believe a concept called genetic determinism. The significance of genetic determinism is this. It is a belief that says that at the moment of conception, when the sperm and egg came together, the genes were selected for your life, and that the rest of your life unfolds from the reading of these genes. Well, there's a problem with that. And the problem with it is this. If it is true, then we become victims of our heredity, don't we? How can we get out of the genes? They're built into us. We can't get out of it. And then also if something else happens, we become irresponsible. The reason is this. If the genes are making me do these things and I can't change my genes, then what is it that I can do with my life except make sure I probably get the proper medication to make me feel better through the process? And the issue comes down to this point, that this assumption is an assumption. That it's not true, that genes do not control who you are. And yet I will have to go through this by going through the fact that there are 3 assumptions that science is based on that are totally wrong at this time. And these 3 assumptions include assumption number 1. This is assumption that says that biological processes employ Newtonian mechanics. What does that mean? It means this. According to the Newtonian world, the Newtonian vision, the universe is a machine, that it's made out of physical parts, and that if you understand how the physical parts interact, you can understand everything about the machine, and that there's no room for energy in there. It's only physical parts. So the relevance is this. By the belief in Newtonian physics, medicine does not entertain the notion that energy is involved in the healing process. Of course, Newtonian physics is out of date now by 75 years because we entered the quantum era in 1925, and yet medicine is still stuck in the biological Newtonian phase, and I'm going to talk about this in the second half of the talk. The second assumption is what I'm going to spend most of the talk on for the first part. The second assumption is based on this, that genes control biological expression. Well, I'm going to show you exactly the absolute chemical truth that genes cannot control biological expression for a very simple reason. Genes can't turn themselves on and they can't turn themselves off. So the genes aren't controlling themselves. They can't control anything else either. And I'll explain where the control comes from. And third, the assumption that Darwinian evolution provided for the existence of the biosphere as we see it. This, again, is another mistake in our assumption, that in fact, that it is not a Darwinian process that got us here. It's more of what we call a Lamarckian process, and the relevance of that is that organisms always match their environment, and as the environments change, the organisms change to adapt to those environments. Well, what does that mean about yourself? What environments are you living in, and what are your belief systems? They become very important because what we find now is that your genes will adapt to your beliefs, and this becomes a very, very critical part of our understanding about life. In order to read the genes of the cell, then what I have to do is affect the protein. So let's look at the flow chart now. Here's the current version of the flow chart. Remember before it was DNA, RNA, and protein, the conventional one that's in all the textbooks? And the answer is, well, that's incorrect. It's totally incorrect. For the answer is the DNA is covered by regulatory proteins. And to get the regulatory proteins off, the sleeve off so I can read the gene, I need an environmental signal. So the bottom line is this. You're not controlled by DNA. You're controlled by environmental signals. And this is what Niehaut writes in his paper. Just reading the yellow lines is the answer. You are not controlled by genes before it's a signal from its environment that activates the expression of the gene. So all of a sudden it says, wait a minute, then I'm not genetically determined? No, You're environmentally determined. And all of a sudden, so what's, we have to talk about how does that happen. Let me explain the mechanism. First of all, what is the environment? Well, the environment, there are two environments that affect all of us. There's an internal environment under your skin, the environment of your physiology, your blood composition, the temperature of your body, the amount of sugar in your body, the amount of nutrients available, the information. This is the environment on the inside. Yet, what is the other environment? The environment on the outside controls us. Why? Because when we live in that environment, we have to adjust ourselves to what's ever happening. And to adjust ourselves, then we change our genes to adjust to the environmental signals, because the environmental signals elicit the gene action. So the question is, so where's the brain of the cell? And the answer is, the brain of the cell is the membrane. It is the skin of the cell. What about our belief that the brain of the cell was the nucleus? And the answer is this. Science is a male-dominated profession. And since males think with this, they made the brain of the cell. But the bottom line, I'll tell you what the nucleus is. The nucleus is the gonad of the cell. Why? What is the function of the nucleus? To make the programs and blueprints to replace the parts. So when I need new parts, I go to the gonad to give me reproduction. So the nucleus is for reproduction. It's not for brain. The brain of the cell is the membrane. And I don't have a lot of time to go into exactly why, but you have to understand that the membrane is the most primitive structure in biology. The most primitive organisms have just a single membrane. They don't have anything else in that. And all their functions come from the membrane. So if we understand the membrane, we can then understand how it works. So let me illustrate, for example, how it works. Here are cells on the surface of a culture dish, and if I look at the membrane and I cut into the surface of the cell, this is what we see. That the surface of the cell looks like this layered structure right here that separates the outside environment from the inside environment. The yellow in the middle is like oil, and as a result, the membrane is a barrier that separates the outside from the inside, because water can't go through the middle of the membrane and carry information across. So the self on the inside, under the membrane, is separated from the environment on the outside. But this wouldn't do any functions. This is just protection. To do function, I need the protein that does movement. Proteins do the movement. Proteins do the function. So like I showed you in my poppet bead version of the proteins, that these poppet beads insert themselves into that membrane structure that I showed you. And so the proteins stick inside the membrane. There are two classes of proteins in the membrane. They're very important. One set is called receptors. What's a receptor? Do you have receptors? Of course you do. What? Name some. Skin. What? Name some other ones that people are pretty obvious about. Eyes, ears, nose, taste, touch. Where are all the receptors located? In your skin. And the same with the cell. But in the cell, they're not organized into these structures that we see, but the proteins have antennas on them. And each different thing the cell can see has a different protein with a different antenna. So for insulin, I have a receptor that sees insulin. For glucose, I have a receptor that sees glucose. For light, I have a receptor that responds to photons of light. So for everything the cell can see, there's a special receptor inside the cell. And then the receptor is for what? Taking signals in. That's what receptors do. I see through my receptors. But now when the signals come in, I have to make a behavior to respond to the signal. That's the other set of proteins. The example that I'm going to use from the other set is called a channel. A channel means a canal. And the point about it is, in the resting state, the channel is closed. Nothing can go through the channel. But in an activated state, the channel opens up, and there's a tunnel that goes from one side of the membrane to the other. Let me explain how they work. This is an example of the receptor. Let's explain how it works. The receptor sits in the membrane, has an antenna sticking up, and look at the bottom. Watch what happens when a signal comes in. The signal, remember, the environmental signals cause a conformation change. So look at the shape. So if I'm inside the cell, I know if the signal is there because I can look at it. But when the signal goes away, then the conformation goes back. So remember, I showed you this. Conformation 1, conformation 2. What was the difference between 1 and 2? The signal. So when a signal comes in, the antenna receptor changes its structure. Now the other proteins, the channel looks like this. When we look at the channels inside the membrane, they too float around inside the membrane, but a channel is different because a channel is closed. And we said the channel works when it opens up. So when a signal comes in, it opens up, and then information or molecules can shoot down the tunnel, down into the cell. And they can only do it when it opens and closes. But look, The wrong size signals don't go in, so the channels regulate which things can get in by opening and closing. So what we looked at is this. We saw signals come into antennas and change the structure of the receptor, and we saw that the output device, in this case a channel, can open or close when the signal comes in. Now let's put them together and see what happens when they come together. And the answer is this. The antenna on the left is going to scan the environment. Notice the shape of the protein inside the cell. It's a smooth tube. This is a connector called the G protein. Look at its shape. Can it plug onto that? Yes or no? No. Look at the shape. It won't fit. So that when no signal is there, that connector doesn't connect. But when the signal shows in, it changes the shape, connects this one to this one, changes this one, and this makes a signal. So I have an environmental signal coming in the antenna, and then the channel on the right converts that signal into behavior. Do you understand? It's a switch. So let's see if I can do this one again. If I can show it to you again, it works like this. Again, watch this. This is what controls biology. Antennas receive the signal from the environment, and when a signal is received, it changes the shape of the protein and allows the connecting device to connect the receptor to the output. The output is the channel. The channel creates a signal that enters into the cell, and that signal that now is going to enter into the cell activates the functions of the cell. It causes the cell to move. It causes the cell to digest things. It causes the cell to change its structure or behavior. So the fact is what? This is a signaling device. This is the actual device that controls the behavior of the cell. So how does it work? Well, the receptor picks up a stimulus, right? Say yeah or no. So we go like, yeah. Okay, yeah. And then the output goes through the channel because the channel is closed, and when the signal comes, the channel opens, and then the signal goes down and activates the functions of the cell. So the stimulus is received by the receptor, and the response is produced by the channel or the effector. So when I put that together, what does it mean? It says this. It says stimulus response, that biology is stimulus response, that the inputs, the signals from the environment, are collected by the receptors, and the receptors read the environment, whether they're reading the external environment or the internal environment. But once they receive a signal, I get a response. That's the output. Behavior is a response. So the output is mediated by effectors, such as the channel. So the bottom line is this. Environmental signals elicit behavior. Got it? If I remove the environmental signals, what behavior do I have? None. And this is an interesting point. As I said, I could take the nucleus out of the cell. I don't change the behavior at all. But if I go to the cell and cut off the antennas, the cell has no behavior. Now just think for a second. Stop and just think for the profound meaning of what this says. Then the behavior you're expressing is what? A reflection of the signals that come from the environment. So all of a sudden, your behavior is not coming from the inside as much as it's totally a reflection of what you see on the outside. And so that this is changing your life is through this. But this device is what controls the cell. That there are thousands and thousands of these input and output devices controlling the cell. Now, is it clear at least that how this acts as a switch? Say yes or no so I know we're doing okay. Well, if now you recognize that each one of these things can activate a function of the cell. Now, this is the beautiful part because I'm going to let you say the words. Is it true or not that the receptor represents awareness of the environment? Okay. Is it true or not that when the channels or whatever the output devices are start to create a physical response, that they create a physical sensation in the cell? Okay, so is this what controls the cell, or at least a function within the cell, yes or no? What is this called? And the answer is, in the dictionary, there is a word for this. And the word is perception. Awareness of the environment through physical sensation. And basically, so you just saw the labeling of what? A device that controls the cell. What is this device that controls the cell? Known as perception. So are you controlled by genes? No. You're controlled by perception. Perception is how you read the environment and adjust your behavior. It makes sense because if your behavior is linked to the environment, then you're coordinated with the environment. If your behavior is not connected to what's going on in the environment, you're out of sync, and that actually is neurological problems in many cases when your behavior doesn't fit the environment. So the point about it is this. Cells started to come together into community. And why this was relevant is each cell is reading what it should do by reading the environment. But when cells start to come together in a community to make a multicellular organism like you or myself, then something has to happen. What's different about the individual versus a community? And it's this. If I'm just a free-living cell, I can walk around and do anything I want, and it doesn't make any difference. But if I join a community, then the word community has meaning. It means communication. It means holding it together. That as an individual cell in the community, I can't do what I want to do. I have to do what the community agrees. That's part of the deal. If I give up my independence, I give it up to join the community. But the reason for joining the community is I've got greater chance of survival with more members all working together. That's what community is all about. That's why people came together to form communities instead of living alone, because community brings greater life. But when I look at that, then here's the important understanding. If a cell doesn't listen to the community's voice, then the cell is not part of the community. Cancer cells have withdrawn from the community. They're still in there, but they're not listening to the voice of the community. They're doing their own thing. Why would some cells get out of the community? And the answer is, why are people homeless? Why are people out of work, or why are people separating? If the community is not supporting them, at some point the cells recognize, my God, what do I want to be in this for? So there's a point that cancer starts to recognize as a result of breakdown of community. Well, let's look at cells moving in community. This is a movement of a bunch of cells, and I'm going to show you the communication using a special dye. I can show you how the cells are communicating in this community. There's a dye that you can see the nervous connection of cells. Now in this one, the dye lights up. It's a fluorescent dye. Now you see the sparkling and flashing? That's the neurological process of each individual cell. But watch what happens. Waves of information start. Why? Because the cells are connected to each other. So the actions of some cells are spreading to other cells. So what you're actually looking at, it's sort of like an electroencephalograph of cells. You're watching cells talking to each other because cells work together in a community. When the community falls apart, that's when disease starts to happen, because that means that they're not, for some reason, they're not being supported, and that will then lead to the end of the community. So the point about it is this. Each cell has a brain. That's a fact. Each cell can read the environment and adjust its function for whatever it sees. But when cells get in a community, they defer their own belief system or their own system of what they're seeing to the central command. So as you can see here, I have a cell here on the right-hand side, marked in purple over here, that this cell is out here in the environment. But what should its function be? Well, the answer is it's going to be coordinated by the brain, because the brain is going to tell all the cells what we should do to work together to provide for the success of my living organism. So the brain gets in between the environment and the cell. The cell no longer reads its own environment. The cell depends on the central nervous system to tell us about the environment. So the bottom line is this. The cell on the right is intelligent. It will always be able to adjust itself to the environment. That's when I was taking cells out of sick people and putting them in culture, they started to get better, because when left alone, they could say, man, I could live comfortably alone without being in that system anymore. And then, so the fact is, so what regulates a cell now? When it's in a community, the cell reads the environment, which is the left side, but it doesn't read it directly. It now reads the environment through the brain, and the brain interprets the environment and then tells the cell what adjustment it should do to live in the environment that is seen. And the issue is, in general cases, this wouldn't be any big deal. But the issue deals with, what about our perceptions? Because perception is controlling the cell, not the genes. Well, let's ask some simple questions about perceptions. So you can take a test here, because it's a perception test. And the perception test works like this. Very simple question. Is A, the surface area of A, greater than, equal to, or less than the surface area of B? What's your answer? Less. Cool. But that's so easy. Everybody can figure this guy out because they're nice little square boxes. But what if they're not so square? What if they're irregular shapes? So let's take a look at it this way. Okay, you take this test. I'm going to ask 4 questions, and then I'm going to go over the answers. And the questions are basically the same in each one. Is the one country greater than, equal to, or less than the other? Equal to means approximate, okay? So the point is this. From your perception, and they get easier because I don't want, everybody to get all the answers wrong, because you'll go home disgruntled. So I make them easier as we go along. The first one, is South America greater than, equal to, or less than Europe in surface area? Okay, hold that. Another tough one, not as tough, but is Scandinavia greater than, equal to, or less than India? Make a decision on that. And if you have trouble with that, let's make an easier one. Alaska and Mexico. And if you really got trouble and you have real vision error, is the North greater than or equal to or less than the South? You got those down? Okay, so now let's look at the answers. The answer is South America is twice as large as Europe. You got that right? You got it right. Good. Okay, let's talk about Scandinavia and India. India is 3 times larger than Scandinavia. Did you get that one right? Oh, okay, maybe the easier ones. Let's go to the easier ones. Mexico and Alaska, they're about the same size. Okay? And lastly, the North and the South. The South is twice as large as the North. Okay, everybody got 100? Well, what's the point about this? And the point about it is what? This is your perception. What's it based on? The map. And so the reality is this. Let's look at the map. The map was made by Germans. So where do you think the dead center of the map is? And what's the equator represent? What's the equator represent? It's the midpoint between the North and the South. But on the maps that we have studied ever since we were kids, where's the equator? It's 2/3 down the bottom of the map. So if I adjust the equator and bring it back into the proper order, then this is the map that you will see, because this is the map that was put out by the United Nations. And the relevance of this map is what? It's not the world as you thought it was, right? And it basically, remember that third world, that little place someplace else? The third world is twice as large as the first world. And our perceptions have been off. Our perceptions, which make us act in response to our perception, if we would use this map, if your life was dependent upon getting 100 on this exam, there would be a lot of dead people in this room at some point. So the point is what? The point is perception is what gets between the environment and the cells. But what do we know about perception now? What do we just know? We just heard it. Perceptions may not be right. So rather than calling perception of the environment, beliefs. It's your belief about the environment that adjusts your physiology. And your beliefs become then most important because your beliefs are connected to your genes. And that the expression that you have is related to what you have going on in your head. Think about it. Maybe perhaps think about a time when you were really sick and you said, oh, God, I can't get up. And then somebody said, look, you've got to come to work right now. You've got to do something. You had to change your belief. What happened? You changed your belief, you got up, you got dressed, and you did the job just fine until you were able to go home and say, God, I think I can sit down and be sick now again. And so the issue is this, that the point is the truth. Perception selects genes, but perceptions may not always be right. And therefore, perceptions, by definition, are called beliefs. And therefore, when I put that back into the equation, you're not controlled by genes, you're controlled by belief. And why that also comes to an important point is this. These women dance because their passion in life is to dance. They have no other belief except for the fact that they know they're going to dance. Age is not relevant to these women. Aging is a belief. And the problem with this belief about aging is that it will kill you. The belief of aging will kill you for this reason. As soon as you start to tell yourself in your perception that you can't do something anymore, then your biological system will adjust to prove you right. You will not do what you think you can't do. And the issue that you know has to do with use and disuse. And aging is one of the serious problems of disuse. When we tell people, okay, you're too old, stop doing this. People say, okay, I'm going to retire. My father worked 6.5 days a week. He retired and he died within a year. Why? And most people in some level are involved with sickness and illness after they retire. Why? Because what are you telling your body? What's your belief? You are finished. You are finished. And the significance is this. When we start to pretend we're finished, we stop doing things. When we stop doing things, the body will start to resorb the structures. Things like osteoporosis. Why do so many people have osteoporosis at that age, that older age? Well, how many of those people, for the greatest exercise, turn the television on and off? If you sit down and you do not exercise, then the system will take itself apart. You don't have to be old for this to occur. I could have a 10-year-old kid with a broken arm, and when I put a cast on that kid's arm, and I come back 6 weeks later and take the cast off and compare the muscles, there's going to be half the amount of muscle in the arm. And the bone density is going to be greatly reduced, showing osteoporosis, if that was what your assessment was. And the bottom line is the kid doesn't have osteoporosis. What's the function? He's not using it. And just recently, it has been repeated several times now, the primary cause or contributing factor of Alzheimer's, lack of use of the brain. That when people separate and as they get older stop communicating, this is one of the main contributors to dementia. The fact that when you stop using your brain and start turning it off because I'm finished, the brain, just like the muscles in the arm, will start to remove the cells because the intelligence of the system is so superb. It says efficiency is the basis of life. We don't, as humans, we don't know nothing about efficiency. I'll tell you that right now. Cells do. Cells know that if a structure is not being used, they will not support it. And the relevance about it is this. The vitality of these women is the vitality of their belief system, the fact that they know they're not finished. And that keeps them alive and it keeps them young. And there are people out here in the audience that know there are some people out here that are working past their retirement age and they're healthier and happier for the process. So again, the end, this first part, this is the understanding. You are machines made out of proteins. The proteins move in response to the signals. The signals are controlled by the membrane, which reads the signals and then adjusts the body by sending signals to the body to respond to the environment. That the environmental signals are perceptions by definition. You saw it. Awareness of the environment through physical sensation is perception. But then, as we also saw, perception may not be accurate. And when a perception is not accurate, then it's really a belief more than a perception. And the bottom line is this. The conclusion is that beliefs run the genes. And we know this in many cases, especially people that have terminal cancer. The only ones that can really get out of that pronouncement of death are the people who do what? Change their entire belief system and say, I'm not buying that story. I'm out of here. I'm going out to live my life. And when they do, they take control of their life. And guess what? They start to manifest a remission and more health through the process. So the bottom line is, the truth is you are not genetically controlled, but you're controlled by your perceptions. Now, when I extend this in the next half, what I'm going to extend on and talk about is simply this. The signals that are in the environment are not just physical signals, as materialistic Newtonian biologists believe. That energy is equally valuable in eliciting biological systems, and I'll demonstrate that, as well as molecules. I will also start to talk about the role of parents and conscious parenting, because the belief of the parents is now recognized to select the genes in the fetus. That if you were a parent or you were once a baby, then that would be very important to you for the following reason. It reveals that the life that we express today was very, very much shaped by the belief of our parents. And I'll talk about that, and then the most important part, how belief can rewrite your genes, and I will show you the science of that when we come back from the short break. Thank you very much.